Welcome back out on the mushroom trail. It is just a beautiful May day out here. Doesn't get much more perfect than this. Sun's shining, spring life is just bursting at the seams out here, and boy, I'll tell you, I can't wait to see what we encounter today. Let's jump into this forest. Let's see what we see. And just down here, we've got a mushroom that I'm super excited about. This is one of my favorite little mushrooms to encounter out here. Notice from the top, it looks kind of like a suede bolete. It's got that velvety little cap, very Xerocomellus or Xerocomus looking, but when I turn it over, take a look. Bright yellow, beautiful gills as opposed to a sponge layer. So this is actually what we refer to as the Western Gilled Bolete, Phylloporus arenicola. And this is just such a beautiful, vibrant little mushroom. You can see a little brown streaking there on the stipe. This is, of course, famous for its bright yellow gills. And then also it'll oftentimes have these golden rhizomorphs that come off of the base of it. But it's got this nice, soft, velvety feel, and it's just a real beauty. This is actually an edible mushroom that is one of my favorites to encounter out here. Now here's the catch, is that usually when I bump into this, I see 1, 2, maybe 3 of these if I'm lucky. They tend to not occur in great numbers. But as I pan up and I take a look around in this immediate area, ooh, did you hear that? I'm hearing quite a bit of interesting activity. These bald eagles, they're especially active right now. Feels like they're checking things out, doing a little foraging of their own. But anyhow, as I was saying, this whole entire area seems to be just filled with gilled boletes right now, which again is super unusual. Take a look at this. Here's another one. And you can see that, it's got that very suede bolete or Xerocomellus look to it. But obviously those gills really stand out as being unique. And this is the exact same little patch of forest that I love to frequent for both Pacific golden chanterelles and the white chanterelles as well. So this is, primarily a Doug fir hemlock forest here, obviously moss-covered ground, but it's just littered with these gilled boletes, which is such a rare thing. Now, I'll bump into these mushrooms at these lower elevation forests in the springtime. And then, as the season progresses, these will move up to higher elevations up in the mountains. So I think I first featured this maybe in a video in August that was out in the Cascades, and I found just a single one of these all by its lonesome. This one you can see has been out a little while. I fear that it may be a little bit buggy. I saw a little bit of a bug mark in by the stipe, so I'll have to investigate these. But boy, it's cool to see such good numbers of these. And here's another. Isn't this just beautiful? I may just have to forage a few of these and at least get a spore print out of the deal, but hopefully get enough that are bug free to cook up. Definitely a treat. And I put out a video last year. It was late spring, early summer, and I featured the shaggy parasol. We talked about forest bathing, and we also featured some mycoheterotrophic plants, one of which is one of my all-time favorite mycoheterotrophic plants, the ghost pipe. And that was shot in this exact same area. So even though I'm a little early this year, on a whim, I figured might as well check in and just see if I see any sign of this one starting to pop out. And sure enough, take a look. Look at what's popping out of the ground right here. Isn't this incredible? So again, this is an achlorophorous plant. So this is lacking chlorophyll. It's mycoheterotrophic, meaning that it's going to partner with mycelium. This particular one, again, this is the ghost pipe, Monotropa uniflora. This partners with the mycelium of the Russula family. In this exact spot is where I found quite a bit of this last year. And you know, as I look around, I'm noticing different little spots out here where the ground just kind of seems to be slightly uplifted. See that there? I wouldn't be surprised if there are more clumps or clusters of this soon to reveal themselves, but this is widely regarded as a somewhat sacred plant that produces a really strong medicine that's actually a nervine. So it contains a lot of powerful bioactive compounds and alkaloids that aren't necessarily well understood. And in case you want to learn more about this one, I'll go ahead and drop a little link to that video that I put out last year. I'll try to remember to put it right here in the video, and then it should show up in the show notes as well. So check that out. If you're not familiar with this one, it's definitely one that's worth spending some time getting to know. And just down here, we've got what is an iconic mushroom of the Pacific Northwest that, I'll tell you what, this time of year, springtime as well as fall, it tends to fruit prolifically in our local forests here. It seems to really favor Douglas fir, but I generally see it all over the place out here. And this is, of course, related to the famous Amanita muscaria, which is an iconic mushroom in its own right. This is its close relative, Amanita pantherinoides. This is commonly referred to as the Western Panther Cap. For quite some time, this was referred to as Amanita pantherina, but DNA analysis has shown that our species that we have here in Western North America is different than that in Europe, which is where that previous name roots back to. But notice we've got white gills, we've got a skirt from that partial veil, we call that the annulus or ring, and down here we see that we've got this egg-like sac that this was born out of, referred to as the cup or vulva. That it's worth noting that those blotches or warts on the cap that are so characteristic of our amanitas are remnants of the universal veil. So when it broke out of that shell, that's the stuff that was left behind from the covering. Beautiful to see. And right nearby those handsome looking panther caps, Amanita pantherinoides, we've got what I believe is the exact same mushroom, but looking quite a bit different. Look down here. So this one's been out for quite a while, and we can see that it's dried out, it's lost its color. So this has got some serious age on it. But as I dig down, see how it's got this very characteristic Amanita structure that we just referenced, of that vulva or sac or egg-like structure down there. So it's possible that this could be a different Amanita species, but looks to me to just be an old and weathered example of the one that we were just looking at a second ago. And as I glance over here, check this out. So we've got some slug slime. It's interesting because this mushroom is especially toxic to dogs and humans. There's oftentimes frequent poisonings, especially of puppies and older dogs, that can be fatal. But look at this. We've got this slug, the culprit, live in action, eating this with seemingly no ill effects. So they can get away with what would bring potential harm to ourselves or our pets. And this time of year, the forest is just so vibrant. I'm always blown away by just the sheer volume of vivid green. You know, there's so many different shades and tone, from this new growth on the sword fern to the mosses. And check this one out as I pan over here. So we've got all this beautiful new growth of these sword ferns, but then down as a ground cover, one of my favorite spring plants. This is what's known as the false lily of the valley. And even though this produces what's regarded as an edible berry, historically it wasn't really used as a food source, but it was oftentimes used medicinally, especially for poultices and specifically things having to do with eye health. I always feel like this one catches my eye, so maybe there's something to that. But yeah, it's just magical to just pause, stop, look around. Boy, look at the way. I'm not sure if this is catching up on film or, registering on film the same way as it is to my eye, but the sun is hitting this sap of this Douglas fir in quite a stunning way. But anyhow, I always feel like, any one of these spring days, I could just stand in the same spot for hours and continue to find new things to marvel at, different perspectives. Just looking around, there's so much going on out here. What a great time to be out in the forest. And further up the trail here, our array of vivid spring greens certainly continues. But we've got something else jumping out at us up here. Check this out. So one of our old friends here, this is the deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus atropurpureus. A lot of times this will look quite a bit darker and also smaller. We can see that this one is really over mature, right? It's blown out. But if I look underneath, we see this sponge layer, this pored surface, and we can see that that's yellow in color. Now, earlier today, we talked about the western Gilled bolete. It's kind of, hard to imagine that these are related to one another because that fertile spore-bearing surface is so very different. But again, all that DNA analysis recently that's been conducted has kind of further assured all the taxonomists, much to their chagrin, that they are in fact boletes that are gilled in that other batch. So this is of course one of our favorite spring edibles, but look, as I push on this, this is not too tempting to forage today. Maybe if I had been here a week ago and caught this when it was first fruiting out, it might find its way into my basket. But today, just something to admire, and again, pretty cool to compare that to the western Gilled bolete. They're very closely related, and cool to see. So just off to the side of the trail here, we've got a massive fern. I'm about 6 feet tall, and a lot of these ferns that I'm seeing are looking me right in the eye. So these particular ones that I'm looking at now are about 6 to 7 feet tall. It's not unheard of for these to reach 16 feet in height. So this is one of our fastest growing plants out here, if not the fastest growing plant. This is the Bracken Fern. And this is a really interesting one. So it's got super deep rhizomes. You may have seen this one in the footage from last week's video where I was in a burn area looking at burn morels. These will survive those fires for the simple fact that their rhizomes are so deep. And those rhizomes historically were consumed by virtually all of the native peoples in this area. They would cook those up, and it was an interesting food source. Now, a caveat to that, sometimes people will forage this for the fiddleheads. But, even though this has a widespread historical use, recent science has proven to us that it contains carcinogenic compounds. So to the point where, there are certain geographic areas where the fiddleheads of these particular ferns are really popular. Say, I think in Japan and Wales, both of those locations have been found to have really high incidences of a somewhat rare stomach cancer. So this is one to admire, but I wouldn't recommend consuming it. Ooh, and in amongst the ferns, the signs of the first salmonberry that I'm seeing. Excited for those to come out in full force. And I realize that some of you may hear what I just said about Bracken Fern and think, what gives? I've seen fiddlehead ferns in the farmers markets, or, even this past weekend I was at a restaurant in Seattle that was serving a dish with fiddleheads. So we've got a different fern here, and this is most likely here in the Pacific Northwest. This is the type of fern that's most likely being foraged for its fiddleheads. And this is what's commonly referred to as the lady fern. We can see some sword ferns mixed in back there, but this kind of larger one that has a really distinct, what's oftentimes described as a diamond shape. So it'll taper at the tip of the leaves and at the base. This, along with ostrich ferns, tend to be the ones that are most often regarded as being more safe. So it's a little bit of a mystery at this stage. I used to love and still love reading Yul Gibbons' different accounts of foraging and consuming wild edible plants and whatnot. He was a huge fan of fiddlehead ferns, and I believe that he was most fond of the ostrich fern, if I recall correctly. But that one doesn't really grow here in Washington state. You're more likely to encounter that one up in British Columbia or Alaska or different places back east. The lady fern is, by all accounts, about as good as it gets out here. So this is a good one to know and to be able to distinguish this or differentiate it from the bracken fern. And of course, while we're on the topic of ferns, might as well talk about the one that we encounter most frequently out here in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. This is the sword fern. And you can see, this is an evergreen. So this is obviously the new growth. So you can see these curled heads of the new fronds here of the sword fern popping out. But this is really quite characteristic of our Northwest forests. And boy, just a beautiful shade of green out there. You can see the fresh growth. And that really contrasts with the evergreen growth from last year's leaves. But this is one of those things that, no matter how many times I encounter this one in the springtime, it's always interesting to kind of stop and admire and look at these different little growth patterns that are emerging here on the sword fern. Kind of cool. Looks a lot like a seahorse tail or something unfurling. We can see it may be difficult to mistake this one for food just with how hairy and unappetizing that may look, but still a joy to admire out here. And take a look at this. So just off the side of the trail in this mossy little slope here, we talked about slowing down and changing your perspective, looking real closely. Look at these little black cup fungi. I always love bumping into these. Again, here's my thumb for perspective. These are super, super small, micro little cups. Just beautiful to see. We've referenced these in videos past. It can be really tough to get these down to species because we've got lots of different mushrooms that look pretty similar. We've got the Plectania genus, Pseudoplectania, Urnula, to name a few. But look, we've got another one hiding just down over here. So easy to miss. In fact, I've got to say, every time that I happen to get lucky and one of these catches my eye or I'm able to detect it, I can't help but wonder, how much stuff am I missing out here? How much do I walk right by every day and never really have a clue of what's going on? I always feel like these small little species here are such good reminders of how much is going on that we're just simply not aware of or that we tend to overlook. I always feel like once I do spot these, it's so easy to get lost in these little worlds. And here's another small little mushroom that's often easily overlooked. This one, commonly referred to as the jelly spot fungus, Dacrymyces stillatus. I believe that that's what this is anyways. There are some of these that are, these are of course related to the witch's butters A lot of times we'll talk about Dacrymyces chrysospermus or some of the tremella jelly mushrooms. This one is going to occur on conifer logs, and you notice that it's just a little less developed, right? There's a reason it's called jelly spot fungus, because it just makes these little round clumps or dots on these small conifer logs. So, fun one to observe. And it just continues to be a beautiful day out here. I've got an interesting little cluster of mushrooms at my feet here. Take a look at this. This is what's commonly referred to as the Petticoat Mottlegill, Paniolus papillinaceus. And you'll notice this is one that I tend to bump into fairly often, oftentimes in significant numbers. We can see there's quite a cluster here. Now this is one that you may see on a trail, you may see it in a pasture or a field, and all of this is somewhat dependent on whether or not there's the presence of horses or cattle or other livestock. This is one of our dung-loving mushrooms, so it's going to grow from that manure. And, you know, anytime that I bump into this on the trail, it's interesting because it's usually specific to trails that are being used by horses. So, you know, oftentimes if I look at the base of these mushrooms, it isn't always apparent at first blush, right? Because sometimes that manure gets washed out. But look there. You can see, ooh, and there's a little pin just popping up. See that guy back there? But anyways, these are associated with our horses and our cows, and it's one that is not uncommon by any stretch of the imagination. I see it anywhere that livestock is present. So, and we can see it's got this, let's give it a tug here. So we can see underneath, take a look at this. Let's zoom in and look at some of the distinct features here. So notice around that margin, we've got kind of that ragged edge. Sometimes people describe that as like kind of a toothed edge. The proper mycological term, we call that an appendiculate margin. So that's the remnant of a partial veil hanging off on that tattered edge. But even more interestingly, let's zoom in on these gills. So as the common name suggests, notice that the gills have a mottled color or structure. So these have very dark spores, and these gills will start out initially being a gray color, but they'll become flecked with this black spore color to give it a mottled or speckled appearance. So that's definitely a defining characteristic for this one. I always feel like anytime I slow down to stop and to really take a close look at this one, I always just think it's kind of got a beauty of its own. You know, it's kind of unique out here, and again, one that if you keep your eyes peeled, you're very likely to bump into. And sometimes it's mistaken for other mushrooms that people are looking for on manure, but generally thought of as not being toxic, but not being what most people are after either. So interesting to see out here. That's the Petticoat Mottlegill, Paniolus papillinaceus. And any time I'm out in the forest on a day like today where it just feels so good, being out here breathing in the forest air, I always think back to the studies out of Japan that really focus on phytoncides. Those are the aromatic volatile compounds. They're basically essential oils that are released by all these trees. So these are natural compounds that the trees actually use to bolster their own immune defense against things like insects and viruses, even maybe fungi. So these have names, you know, like alpha or beta pinene, and they're essentially these compounds that literally fill the air out here in the forest. And when we breathe them in, they benefit our immune systems too. So they actually boost our natural killer cells, lower blood pressure, reduce stress, all kinds of good things happening just being out here in the forest, immersing ourselves in nature. So a lot of times we're out here foraging medicinal plants and mushrooms, but you know, a good part of the medicine is really just being out here. breathing in the air and letting our bodies just be at peace. And take a look on this downed alder log. We've got quite a bit of stuff going on over here. This one especially catching my eye. This is one of our scaly caps in the Pholiota genus, likely the Golden Pholiota, Pholiota orivella. I expect to see this in the fall, but oddly enough this spring I've seen quite a few fruitings on dead alder. We've also got the Brittle Cinder, Kretschmaria deusta. We talked about this one a few weeks ago. That one is an interesting little decayer of sorts. And then we've got the artist conch as well, Ganoderma applanatum. If I go ahead and I scratch the underside with my nail, you'll see that it leaves a mark. That's a definitive feature of this one, and we can tell that this log has been rolled because that pore surface of that artist conch would typically be downward facing. So kind of interesting, as I swing around and take a look, I can kind of see the impression back there of where that log was not too long ago. Whoa, look at this. This is kind of crazy. Look at this growth. This is actually coming out of the log. Boy, this actually looks to be a trillium that's growing or fruiting right out of this alder log. We see a younger one back there. Boy, it's just amazing to think about the vital role that all this standing and down dead wood, this really fills an important niche out here in the forest ecosystem. So much going on in a single log. And I simply had to take a closer look. So I bucked over this log. Look at that. Isn't that amazing? I think that is a trillium that's somehow growing right out of that alder log. And I'm just off to the side of the trail, and something caught my eye out here. Another just incredibly cool plant. You know, earlier we talked about the ghost pipe, Monotropa uniflora. This is yet another mycoheterotrophic plant. This one of our orchids. This is what's commonly referred to as the Pacific coral root, Corallorhiza mertensiana. Let me see if I can get it to focus in here to give you a slightly better look. So here you can see what it's looking like early May. So it actually hasn't flowered yet, but again, this is one of our wild orchids that pairs with ectomycorrhizal fungi. And similar to the ghost pipe that we were talking about earlier, this one has a partnership with Russulaceae. So our Russula mushrooms are going to oftentimes be found fruiting in the same area. And that family also includes Lactarius, so that's another potential associate. But really cool to think that just like the ghost pipe, so this plant doesn't have any chlorophyll. So it's developed this really unique strategy to, gain its access to carbon through pairing with these ectomycorrhizal fungi that are working with the trees. So this one indirectly is working with all the trees around here, and it's developed this really unique strategy to kind of thrive out here in the forest. We're just learning about these now. And in the not too distant past, it was assumed that all of these were saprophytes that were living off of dead wood. But we now know that that's definitely not the case. And where I typically see one of these, there are oftentimes many. So I'd encourage you, if one of these jumps out at you or catches your eye, I encourage you to slow down and take a look. Even though they have this bright coloration that is vivid and distinct in its own way, they have a unique ability to blend in nonetheless. So we can see another one hiding over here. Beautiful to see. And all over this forest, I'm seeing something really interesting. So this forest had a lot of blowdowns from the weather events this past fall. Look at these little shavings on this Douglas fir bark. This is something called frass, and this is the hallmark or signature of the Douglas fir beetle, which has burrowed into this down tree, into the bark layer, to dig its galleries and to lay its eggs. Now, I saw a lot of this last week as well in the burn area. So live Douglas firs have a resistance to the Douglas fir beetle, but once they're blown down or burned, they're susceptible. So soon to follow, within the next year or so, will come the veiled polypore, Cryptoporus fulvatus. And the spring season always gets me so excited. Just down here, it's interesting because something triggering one of my earliest spring memories. I remember just as a child, for the first time, finding the remnants of a robin egg. And you know, this blue color is such a rarity out here in nature. It still gets me excited any time that I stumble across anything with that blue color out here in the wild. And just up here on the side of the trail, hiding underneath this log, we've got another prime example of one that we discussed earlier. This, of course, being the western panther cap, Amanita pantherinoides. Just a real beautiful example. And you know, we talked about this one being toxic to both humans and their pets, especially puppies and older dogs. And this one contains quite a bit of both ibotenic acid and muscimol, reportedly in higher quantities than the Amanita muscaria. So, and that can vary quite a bit depending on age and season and all that stuff, but always beautiful to see. And just up here, another one of our favorite little mushrooms. Boy, looking especially stunning out here in the sunlight. Look at that. This one's commonly referred to as the tiger's eye, Coltricia perennis. And boy, in this light, you can really get a sense of what this might feel like. You know, you can almost see what that texture feels like. And as I look underneath, let me see if we can get a good perspective or vantage point underneath here. Yeah, look at that. So we see those decurrent pores. So a pored surface running down the stipe. This one really stands out as being unique because typically our polypores are saprophytic and they're growing on dead wood. But this one noted for being very unique in the simple fact that it's one of our only polypores that creates ectomycorrhizal relationships with trees. So this one is actually linking up with the root system of all the surrounding trees that it comes into contact with. So very cool mushroom. We can see how oftentimes the caps will become fused together. So we can see several caps making a single body here, but beautiful to look at. And here's yet another example of that same one, but I wanted to point it out because it's looking quite a bit different, right? So you can see again that fused cap action, and you can see those pores that are decurrent running down the stipe there. But we see these ones are a little bit less developed. They've still got a similar texture or feel to the top, but depending on where they're at in their cycle of growth, sometimes you'll see these that have really fruited out and matured into substantial caps. Other times they'll be less pronounced and a little more subtle like this one. But really cool to see these guys out here doing well this spring. And take a look at this beautiful little guy down here. So this is what's commonly referred to as the yellow spotted millipede. Every time I see these, I'm just blown away by their features. Now, it's worth noting that these bright yellow spots that really stand out amongst the forest floor, these serve as a warning sign for all the other creatures out here in the forest. You know, if I were to pick this guy up, he would likely curl up and he'd start to exude a toxic chemical, hydrogen cyanide. And that's how this one gets its other common name. Sometimes people refer to it as the cyanide millipede. And while that's not enough to really cause harm to us, depending on your sensitivity, you know, you might get a rash or a blister. But to rodents and birds, this can be lethal. So this packs quite a punch, and it really keeps this guy protected and allows it to do its thing out here. It's kind of scavenging up, primarily feeding on Douglas fir needles out here, filling an interesting ecological niche of its own out here. So really interesting to note. Now that cyanide is gonna have an almond or toasted almond scent, and that's sometimes it's also called the almond scented millipede. But super interesting to see those little mites on the back of this thing. Surely those are working together, each fulfilling their own role, right? The millipede offering protection, and the mites a little bit of cleaning. Super interesting to see. And boy, the winds are really picking up here this afternoon. Always love it when we get a little wind energy stirring things up out here, making the trees dance a little for us and just getting everything charged. Definitely a fun feeling out here when that happens. And I know that we've already checked in on these guys a couple times today, but boy, they're really out in force today. And every time I see these, I always feel like I have to marvel at just kind of the variability. To me, it's always interesting to see how that cap pattern, that speckling from the universal veil, can change or vary so much depending on those conditions, you know, the moisture and just kind of whether or not they've been rained on. Sometimes they'll be totally devoid of any warty speckling on the cap. Other times they'll have really prominent markings. I think I'm going to leave this guy right where he is. Don't want to disturb him any more than I already have, but what a beauty, right? And just up here, one of my favorite sites, perhaps the perfect one to end on. Look at these little bright orange Ascomycetes, little cup fungi, just rooting out in abundance here on this log off the side of the trail. As we zoom in and we take a look, notice those real fine eyelash-like hairs off the edge of these cups. This is how this one gets its common name, the Eyelash Cup Fungus. This is Scutellaria scutellata group. There are an untold number of species in this group that all fly under that same general name. And no matter how many times I see these guys, they never cease to impress me. Just beautiful. And thanks so much for joining me out here on the mushroom trail today. If you've been enjoying these episodes, don't forget, hit that like button, subscribe, stay tuned, and until next time, happy trails.